Welcome to Research Renaissance, presented by the Karen Toffler Charitable Trust. Embark on a journey into the forefront of cutting-edge brain science as we feature insightful discussions with a diverse array of guests, from early career researchers pioneering groundbreaking science to influential voices in investment communities, policymaking, and research institutions. Together, we delve into neurological diseases, their causes, treatments, and the quest for cures. Join us in advancing our understanding of the brain and addressing its ailments. Welcome to Research Renaissance. I'm Deborah Westphal, your host and guide through the fascinating future of the brain. Joining me today is Dr. Rachel Buckley, Associate Professor of Neurology at Massachusetts General Hospital and Harvard Medical School. Today, we will be discussing Rachel's focus on studying multiple cohorts to understand risk and resilience in preclinical Alzheimer's disease. So welcome, Rachel.
Thank you so much, Deborah. It's such a pleasure to be here.
I'm really fascinated by your focus of study because you are looking at sex differences in the brain.
That's correct.
And, how it relates to dementia or specifically Alzheimer's. So why this focus and what got you started there?
Yeah, actually, I have a wonderful story about that because it actually started from the fact that I didn't actually think there were sex differences. I was a huge critic and skeptic early on. I was actually doing my PhD at the time, focused primarily on concerns about memory. I was really interested in why older adults might be worried about their memory when in fact there was no evidence of any concern on their pen and paper memory tests, or, there was no evidence of a diagnosis or anything. And at the time when we were doing some of this work, it was really actually a lot of interviews. So I was doing a lot of one-on-one heavy qualitative work where I was asking people about their memory, what things they'd noticed changing, trying to test them a little bit on their memory at the same time. And during the interviews, I had noticed actually there were very different ways that men and women were sort of responding to their memory and changes that they thought were changing in their memory. And I, at that point, really didn't think anything of it because there was a very strong, this is about, more than 15 years ago now, where there was a really strong feeling in the scientific community that there really weren't sex differences in dementia risk, that women simply lived longer and therefore were just more likely to get the disease, but the disease itself didn't express differently. And it was such a strong sentiment across the board that I just sort of was raised, I grew up, quote unquote, on this idea that, of course, there aren't any differences. But I was seeing very big differences in how women and men were sort of feeling about their memory. Women tended to be much more concerned about their memory. They also seemed to be much better at being able to communicate any changes in their memory. Men were not as concerned. They didn't tend to pinpoint things as much, that if they were noticing things, it wasn't quite clear what it was they were noticing. And then the other thing that was really interesting too was that women, at least in my qualitative work, women were bringing their husbands in much more often to the doctor. So there was this interesting spousal dynamic as well, where often, a diagnosis might happen a little bit earlier. So the saying goes, because they were simply bringing their husbands in, whereas men might not be noticing as much or may not be as inclined to think about sort of the primary care physician as the first port of call for changes that they might be noticing. So that's sort of where I started. And then I was very fortunate enough to move to Boston. I was training in Australia and I was able to move to Boston in the United States. And I wanted to sort of change the field a little bit. I wanted to change what I was doing and think about what would be my brand going forward as a scientist. And my mentor, who is still my mentor, I would say, Dr. Risa Sperling here at the Brigham and Women's Hospital, she says to me, I want you to look at sex differences. I'm pretty sure they exist. No one's really looking at them. The reason is because people don't think they exist, but I think they do. And she was absolutely right. We see some really fascinating differences, and it's just been a story ever since then that I've been really passionate about it.
Yeah. So are these differences, are they, behavioral? Are they physical? Do you look inside of brain tissue and see differences? Like how, if there's these differences, how vast are these differences and where are those kind of areas of difference?
Yeah, it's a great question. So we first started off with the biology because there'd been quite a lot of work up until then. For many decades, there's been a lot of work looking at sort of dementia itself. There's two different types of ways of thinking about dementia and when people are getting it. One is incidence rates. So incidence is if you're following people in a study and you can simply count the frequency of how often people progress to a dementia diagnosis in that study. So that's incidence. And then there's a second sort of frequency measure, which is prevalence. And the prevalence rate is simply, let's just gather a whole bunch of people in a massive room and count how many people have dementia at that time. So you're not waiting till they get dementia, it's just how many people have dementia. And of those two types of understanding frequency, men and women differ quite a lot. So in prevalence rates, that's the massive room, finding out who has dementia at that point. Men and women differ a lot. So it's, 2/3 of those people in the room with dementia will be women relative to men. And that is a statistic we see in the United States. We see that in Australia. We see that in Britain. There's quite a lot of countries that show this very clear prevalence difference. Now, incidence rates, though, are a lot fuzzier. So if we're looking at when people are actually progressing to the dementia within a study itself, there have been some studies that show that women have faster rates of incidence to dementia. And then there's some that show no difference at all. And the really fascinating thing, this is something that Dr. Michelle Milkey, who's now based at Wake Forest, told me or presented in a finding in a talk a long time ago, and I found it just so fascinating, is that when they find incidence differences, it tends to be in Europe. There's a lot of European studies that show incidence differences, that women have faster incidence rates. And then in America, there's quite a few very well-known studies that don't seem to show a sex difference at all. And that really has sort of caused quite a bit of controversy early on in the field of like, well, is there actually a risk or is there not between men and women? And this was what really drove the longevity argument, that women just simply live longer. There's nothing to do. They don't actually have a greater risk. It's just that they have more exposure to dementia risk the older that they get, and men, unfortunately, don't live as long to show us whether they could have had dementia or not at older age. And so what we decided was, rather than focus on the dementia piece, which had been really explored and was very controversial at the time still, we wanted to look at the biology. And just around the time that we were starting to think about how do we look at the biology, two really now seminal papers, but two really important papers came out looking at autopsy data. They opened up the brains of multiple people who had passed and were happy to donate their brains, and they looked inside the tissue to see the amount of pathology, both amyloid plaques and tau tangles. So these two proteins, they are the hallmark pathologies of Alzheimer's disease. And what they wanted to look at was, are there differences in amyloid plaques or neurofibrillary tau tangles in different regions of the brain in men and women? One of the studies went so far as to look at lots of different regions of the brain, and the other study just simply looked at, I don't care what the region of the brain is, I just want to see, is there a difference? In both of those studies, they found that women and men were not different in their levels of amyloid, or just slightly, if anything. But where they showed massive differences and quite clear, stark differences was in tau tangles. That was the finding at the time. Now, we don't do postmortem work in our lab, and the Harvard Aging Brain Study, where I work and have been working for many years now since I moved to Boston to train, was the Harvard Aging Brain Study. And it is a longitudinal observational study of older adults. So these are older adults who are perfectly healthy at the onset of the study. And we just keep following them. We followed some folks up to 15 years now, and we're hoping to get another round of funding coming up in the next while, which will extend it out to 20 years, which is very exciting. And what we do, which is a real, I guess, unique edge to our group, and there's a couple of other groups in the US who do this as well, but we have a huge collection of amyloid and tau PET imaging. So we can actually look, not just wait till autopsy, we can actually look at the amount of amyloid and tau in the brain during life, and we can follow people with those PET scans. We can keep imaging them, every few years to see not only what is their severity at one time point, but how are they changing over time and in different regions of the brain. So the first thing we did was we looked at the amyloid and tau PET scans just at a single time point, and we just wanted to see, are there any differences? Is it replicating what we see in the postmortem cases? And we were able to find it. We did not see differences between men and women in their level of amyloid, but we saw vastly different levels of tau PET. And this was really interesting because we found it only in certain regions of the brain at the time. We were only looking at regions we thought would be quite, Alzheimer's disease focused. So we just focused on those regions and we found really big differences. We were quite surprised because all of these older adults were healthy at the time. There was no different, they didn't have dementia. And we were seeing these really vast differences. Ever since that finding, this is now being replicated multiple times. We've been incredibly lucky to see that, not only because it's very hard to replicate findings in science, but to see it not only in other people's work, but also across dementia stages. So we see this in healthy older adults, but there's many other findings that show that women have higher levels of tau even once they have a dementia diagnosis, which was really, really striking to us.
Now, do you, all sorts of questions come in, like the European versus United States, was that just how they collected the data? And, but then, on this longitudinal study, does it go premenopausal to where, is there something happening there that is changing? Like I said, the variables are vast. What are those variables that you're kind of looking at? And, any findings there?
So to address your first question, actually, that has been such a fascinating query that people have been trying to understand is what differentiates the European case from the American case. I think there's been a lot of discussion about how we're really thinking about a dementia diagnosis and who's making the diagnosis. There's also some question about cultural differences too. Even though we think that Europe and the US are incredibly similar, there are differences, and there are differences in the healthcare system, how dementia is actually diagnosed in different countries, let alone continents. States even here in the US are quite different in the way that they sort of navigate the dementia diagnosis. So all of these things can play a role. There's also some suggestion that some of the cohorts that were conducted in the US were large single city focus, whereas some of the European cohorts were a mixture of a lot of different sites all over Europe, and all of those things can sort of, play a role in so there's sort of some methods and also some theory associated with it, but no one's really fully, bedded down what exactly might be causing these differences between the continents. But certainly it is true that even if you take into account all of these findings, if you try to put all the findings together, doesn't matter where they come from, there is a slight edge that women seem to have a slight higher level of incident rate. Now, it is still debatable. And the final argument that a lot of people have for this now is not that we don't actually need to see differences in incidence rates between men and women, because if men and women actually have different pathways to get to the same outcome, that actually matters a lot more than having differences in outcome. Because if the biological pathways, the things that drive or might instigate or catalyze or knock you onto the course of Alzheimer's disease, if they're different between men and women, that has huge implications for how you would treat, how you would diagnose, how you would care, and how you would manage the symptoms and the final outcome. So I think for everyone who's listening to this, no one would deny that one of the biggest consequences of all of this is treatment. And if the sort of driving factors biologically are different, we need to know that so that we are customizing our treatments much better in a sex-specific manner. We're still sort of early days in that route, and I wouldn't say we're at a point where I can confidently say, okay, we're definitely going to need different treatments by men and women. But certainly our work at the moment suggests that we do need to be thinking about sex a lot when we're thinking about therapeutics, about care, about diagnosis of the disease. When you're thinking about the question to do with what sort of factors might be driving, these sex differences, we've been doing a lot of different work on this. And there's now a lot of groups who are focused on sex, which is very exciting because we're really at that, I think, apex moment in the field where we're making huge strides in therapeutics. And we're also starting to really better understand what are the driving factors at a population level and what are the modifiable risk factors that can be playing a role in dementia risk. Where we look at sex differences, one of the things that we're really focused on that you had mentioned is menopause. All of the work that we have done up until this time, or most of it, has been focused a lot on the older adults, so people who are over the age of 65. And so the work that I was telling you about early on, where we were seeing differences in tau PET signal, those were much older adults. No one was going through menopause at that stage. What we have since been doing is trying to take it back as early as possible, because I think one of the questions that is really fascinating and hasn't fully been pinned down yet, that's something that my team is really interested in, particularly Dr. Gillian Coughlin in my group. What we're really trying to understand is, like, at what point in the disease process do men and women diverge? And is one of these diverging points to do with menopause? Because if it's menopause, then there's a lot of stuff that we can really dig into to understand why. What is it about the menopause in particular? So one of our findings that we had a few years ago was to look at simply age at menopause, because one of the theories that we have right now, and it has been a potent idea for a long time, and it has a lot of controversy too, is how much exposure to estrogen in your lifetime does that have a protective effect? Because estrogen is a superpower, and we are so lucky. I'm so lucky to be a woman, to be able to have estrogen flooding through my body at most of my life, or a big majority of my life. But when it does recede naturally or surgically or for any other reason, you will notice there will be very large effects that will happen systemically across the body. And one of the things that has been of great interest with menopause transition and this huge decline in estrogen is this potential knock-on effect of loss of estrogen protective effects leading to higher levels of pathology, poorer cognition over time, so on and so forth. What we found in our study is indeed that earlier age at menopause, particularly very, very early, and I'm talking women who are below 40, below 45, that's what we call premature menopause. These are the sort of the highest risk categories for higher levels of tau in the brain. We've also been digging into not just age at menopause, but also the hormone therapy debate. The idea is that if you reintroduce hormones back into the body exogenously, so you're taking some kind of menopause hormone therapy, that this might reintroduce protection. And I can go into the story in a second, but there was we've had a long history of failure with hormone therapy, and I can talk about it. But our study was trying to understand, would hormone therapy increase or decrease the level of risk of tau levels in women? What we found counterintuitively, if you think that reintroducing hormones would be healthy, we found that the reintroduction of hormone therapy actually increased levels of tau relative to non-users of hormone therapy. And we were quite shocked, because you'd think the women who had early age at menopause, they might have taken hormone therapy to try to ameliorate the issue of downstream effects. What we did, though, is instead of just leaving the story there, we dug into it more. And this was Gillian's idea. This is a fantastic idea. What she decided to do was to carve the data up into how long was the duration between when you went through menopause to when you took menopause therapy for the first time. And what we have found is that those women who really delay taking of hormone therapy in relation to their menopause onset, those are the women who have the highest levels of tau. Women who just take menopause therapy right around the time of onset really don't show that elevated risk. And that's been borne out in quite a few studies, that hormone therapy itself is not necessarily a massive risk, for at least for dementia, but that you need to be taking it sort of quote unquote responsibly. So around the age of onset and only for a period of time recommended by the international and national menopause organizations. And they usually recommend, 10 to 15 years, but dependent on what your provider is recommending.
Yeah, it's so interesting because general practitioners don't really want to have this conversation with you. As an aging woman, they really don't. And if you have symptoms of night sweats, well, maybe we'll talk about hormones, but we won't talk about it proactively for the brain. And then there's just some, this crazy, just information out there. I'm a long distance runner and I'm, over 60, and estrogen decreases as you stress your body out. And, how do you protect yourself, in this? So a question on pregnancy, because pregnancy is very violent to a female body. Everything stretches, everything changes. Have you dug into any of that?
Yeah, it's a great question because I have neglected a whole range of different areas. So we might focus on menopause, but there's other areas of menopause too: surgical intervention, natural, spontaneous menopause. There's also other sort of reproductive related factors that can be involved, such as endometriosis or PCOS, or using the oral contraceptive when you're a teenager. There's all these other factors that really we know about them. It's hard to measure them. Certainly, most studies that we look at do not gather very well curated data sets of reproductive history, which is such a shame, considering traditionally most of our observational cohorts are 70% women. Which is quite amazing. And 50% of our population, women. You think there'd be more focus on reproductive health in that way. This is a corner that we're turning now. I'm already seeing that there are much better sort of questionnaires being put out there. You ask about pregnancy, and that is a terrific question because there's two elements to this. One is pregnancy, just generally, and that could be seen as how many live births have you had? How many births have you had? How many children do you have, whether that be foster children or not? There's many different ways of thinking about pregnancy or children, families. And there have been some, not our work, but there have been some fantastic, findings that have come out over the last few years. One of the big ones that I can think of right now is the UK Biobank, which is thousands of individuals that have been collected in certain regions of the UK, the United Kingdom. And they've been following, it's an epidemiological cohort. It's enormous. And they've been following it, these people for quite a long time now, at least a decade, I'd say. Some of them have some imaging, some of them have blood work, but on the whole, they just have a lot of sort of epi data collected. And they have information on pregnancy, oral contraceptive use. They have quite an in-depth reproductive health measure accounted for. And in amongst all that, they also have a dementia status collected. And so there's been quite a few interesting, findings come out. One of the ones that I can think of is Dr. Jessica Gong's work. She's based in the UK. And she was looking at live births and pregnancy and trying to understand if parity, so the number of children that you've given birth to, might increase your protection. The idea being that the more you have been pregnant, the more you're going to have see these huge fluctuations, these huge injections of hormones throughout the body during pregnancy, and then have, real benefits down the line from that. And they have found, and a few other smaller studies have found, that in fact there might be a U-shaped curve to it, that there is actually potentially an increase in protection with more live births, although in their particular finding, they found that 3+, anything beyond that, you're probably going to see a dip. But 1 or 2, you were starting to see somewhat of a monotonic increase. What I mean by that is it was, if you have 1, you have some protection. If you have 2, you have a little bit more. I don't want to say that bears out in every single study, but it certainly was true of the UK Biobank. Now, the fascinating thing, though, they looked at that in mothers, and then they looked at the effect. The outcome that they were looking at was incidence rates of dementia. They then looked at the fathers, and they counted the number of children. They found the exact same U-shaped curve. So one cannot fully say that it would be estrogen or other hormones throughout the body. It could, in fact, be something sociological about having children in your life. Now, a certain number, and I can absolutely attest to there being a certain number of children that can make your life happy, and at which point it just dropped off from there. It becomes asymptotic, surely. But the finding was fascinating, and it gives an insight into there's many, many benefits that can come from pregnancy and sort of family building. The other piece to this, though, is not just pregnancy, but also adverse pregnancy outcomes. So there are many things that can happen during pregnancy biologically to a woman, not just the influx of hormones, but there's things like gestational diabetes, gestational hypertension, there's preeclampsia or even prior preeclampsia signals beyond hypertension. There's many things that happen throughout birth or pregnancy and birth that are really, really important to sort of, even things like C-sections and stuff. All of these things can play a role in later life risk. What we do know is that, gestational diabetes and gestational hypertension are actually, and preeclampsia, are all known factors for elevating cardiovascular events in women later in life. They're also associated with increased risk of, things like heart attack and stroke for sure, but also with increased risk for dementia. These are things that are still sort of being bedded down because, again, adverse pregnancy outcomes are not necessarily consistently reported or collected in these data. So we have to sort of do a lot more digging as we go. But certainly it's true to say pregnancy in and of itself can be both protective and increase risk. It just sort of depends on how you look at it.
Yeah, it's just fascinating, and it's so complex. And it sounds like we've just started to kind of unravel or untangle some of this complexity. You are the chair of the Alzheimer's Association's Sex and Gender Professional Interest. Talk a little bit about what that is, and what are the gaps that in the research that. And it seems like there's a lot, but if you could just kind of summarize, what are the gaps that need to keep being focused on?
Yeah, that's such a great question, Deborah, because actually we're involved right now in a steering committee, the Women's Brain Health Steering Committee, that's co-chaired by the AARP and Genentech as well, to try to actually drill down on all of this and put out a white paper. Because I think, at the moment, there's many of us in the field of sex differences in Alzheimer's disease specifically who are just like, there are so many things that we don't know and we really need to get to the bottom of. And if we could just have a shopping list and then everyone can sort of divvy it out and figure out which bits they're going to run with, that's sort of where we're at. There's so much to be done and there's so little time in some ways. Women really are at the greatest burden of dementia. They do have the highest prevalence rates, but they also have much more impact from caregiving as well. So there's a lot of roles for women to play in terms of burden when thinking about Alzheimer's disease, dementia, and other dementias as well. But the Sex and Gender Professional Interest Area is set up by iStart. It's the Alzheimer's Association initiative to have lots of different professional groups, international groups, that bring the leaders of the field together and anyone else, all trainees, anyone who's looking to go into that particular area of the field. We learn off each other, we collaborate, we share ideas, we write papers together. It's sort of a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to reach across our silos of institutions and disciplines and be able to speak about broad questions that are really hard to do in one lab alone. So the PIA is a really incredible opportunity to ask, one example, for instance, is trying to understand how there might be sex differences in Down syndrome in Alzheimer's disease patients with Down syndrome. these are questions that are actually really tricky to ask at one site. You need a lot of data from a lot of different groups. So people will come from across the world based on these working groups and work on these questions together. That's just one example. But that's sort of what we do. But a big portion of the peer, one of the reasons that we are really passionate about, being a part of this executive committee is that we're really trying to train the next generation. So as I had started out the podcast with saying, there were many people who were skeptics and there were many people pushing against the tide. And it's only in the last sort of 10, 15 years that we've really been able to get back into sex differences. There was quite a lot of sex differences work a while back, and then the Women's Health Initiative happened. I can talk about that event if you're interested, but that really set the field back quite a long way. And a lot of funding was really lost, a lot of opportunity there when there was a failed clinical trial on hormone therapy. And we're just sort of really getting our energy back now. And there's a really strong presence and a strong force now of people, associate professor and professor level. And what we want to do is ensure that stays strong and true. And one way to do that is to ensure that we are, reducing the sort of air gap between the younger, more junior researchers and us, so that they're able to learn from us, work with us, pass along their ideas to make sure that we're enriching the science as we go.
Yeah. And what I hear is it's the ability, you want to train them in the ability to question assumptions, because the more we learn, the more we need to challenge that obsolete kind of thought process. It's not to indoctrinate. That's not what I'm hearing. What I'm hearing is,
no, it's about thinking things. So, okay, let's take another example. A few years ago, we heard about the lecanemab clinical trial outcomes, and they were one of the first. Obviously, aducanumab came out a little bit earlier, but lecanemab's findings were a true change to the field, where we really got to sit up and take notice and say, okay, we haven't cured Alzheimer's disease. Of course not yet. But we moved the needle for the first time ever. And that was just groundbreaking. And it was a huge event for all of us in the field. But one thing that we found buried in the supplemental, page 13, I think it was, of the paper, was there was a sex difference in the level of treatment. And if you look at the figure, what it says is that, okay, so overall there was like a 32% treatment effect in the full group. But if you look at the sexes, men showed a 42% treatment effect. They had a 42% benefit. Women only had 12. It was not mentioned in the main paper. They didn't even do a statistical test to test this. They just showed a figure where you can sort of eyeball the confidence intervals, which is the amount of error around the estimate that they're providing to this 12 and 42% effect. And what it looks like is that women do not seem to show any benefit from this treatment, whereas men did. And that is the first thing that we're hoping that the next generation will continue to do, is to keep digging, trying to understand, what is it about treatment? What is it about outcomes? What is it about pathology? What is it about reproductive health, or the X chromosome? That's something else I'm passionate about. What is it about differences between men and women's biology, as well as the sociocultural elements that could be, manifesting itself to result in differences in risk, both in the biology, but also the dementia? And so that's really important. And we're also trying to communicate to the group. And you had asked about, what are the things that are still unanswered? What would be your sort of takeaway messages? Well, there are a few of them. We still don't know a lot about menopause in terms of how it's impacting dementia. We don't. There are a few massive epidemiological studies out there that are looking into this, but then they don't necessarily do Alzheimer's disease measurements very well. We like to use the word phenotype for that, but yeah, they're not great phenotypes out there for AD. Then there's really amazing Alzheimer's disease studies out there, and they don't necessarily have great menopause measures. Neither the twain shall meet. And so we end up with this, patchwork series of findings that have lots of limitations, and we're unclear on this and that, the other. And because of that, we end up with these professional interest areas, these steering committees, these, to try to pull together what do we know and what do we not know. One perfect example of this is the Wellcome Trust just recently put out for, I believe it was $50 million. They call it a LEAP scientific funding call, just to look at menopause and how it's associated with Alzheimer's disease. And that alone can tell you enough about what we don't know, that we need massive amounts of money just on this topic, like menopause and Alzheimer's disease. Tell us everything, give us your study, and we'll fund it. We just need to know more. This just goes to show you how passionate people are about the topic right now, how much we still need to understand, and where we're at in the field. But the other area I think that really bears a lot of attention as well is the X chromosome. There's a lot of us who are really interested in the genomic aspect and what genes can tell us about risk for Alzheimer's disease. Now, we all know about, for instance, ApoE4, which is the population level genetic risk factor for Alzheimer's disease. And it's a very strong risk factor. It's a very clear and easy to work with variable. But what has often been ignored is the X chromosome. And there's very good reasons for that. It's actually really hard to measure. It's really hard to sort of QC, quality control. It's really hard to look at it in men and women because women have two, men have one. It's sort of hard to figure out exactly what to do with it. And because of that, and also, let's be honest, probably a preponderance of focus on just the normal autosomes, we just haven't looked at the X, not until recently. And there's a few labs now, Dr. Michael Belloy at WashU, Dr. Dina Jubal at UCSF, our team, there's a few others as well, who are really trying to dig into what part of the X chromosome is having the biggest impact for not only risk, but also protection. Because we're starting to see some really interesting X-linked genes that might be conferring protection as well. And the reason we're so interested in the omics side is because this is the opportunity for druggable targets. I talked to you about earlier, wouldn't it be great if we had sort of, therapeutics that are a bit more sex specific? Well, this would be the way to do that. This is untapped potential. People really haven't been looking at the X. And this is literally, scrape below the surface and we'll find all sorts of interesting discoveries. And we already are. We're starting to see some really amazing things coming out. So I think that there's lots of areas that are underexplored, ripe for opportunity, and the time is now.
Yeah, it seems that that also opens up the door to challenge the notion that Alzheimer's or dementias are age-related, that it really is the journey of aging that is creating this, these conditions, if you would, or these diseases. That's fascinating. So, as we kind of wrap up here and look into the future, you're talking about the gaps. Well, the first question is, how big is this community that is focused on this? Because I think some people, and not to get into the politics of the day, because that doesn't do us any good, but they worry that this research is just going away and that, it might set us back again. How big is the community? It sounds like it's a very large community that is, bringing still very good science and, asking the questions of why.
So I would say very confidently that it is quite a large field. And certainly when I, embarked on everything 2017-ish, it was still a burgeoning field, recovering. It was recovering from sort of the Women's Health Initiative setback. And I certainly think that over the last, however many years since then, since 2017, we have seen an explosion in the interest in sex differences. I think part of this is because we've started to see really consistent differences in a pathology across lots of different ways of looking at it. Brain autopsy, which I mentioned, PET imaging, which we do, cerebrospinal fluid, and now plasma, we're starting to see it as well. When you start to see consistent effects coming out, then a lot of people come in going, okay, I want to get to the bottom of this. How do I do it? And so we've had all hands on deck. Honestly, there are people who I never would have in 1,000 years said they would be looking at sex differences. They are doing it. And I tell you what, I'm so grateful. Once you start to get the interest of the general field, not just people who have tried and true been doing this for a long time, that's when you know you're going to make a difference. And so, we've been really, growing and growing in the amount of people who are doing it. I think it also goes to show how much interest there is based on simply the funding. So we have Alzheimer's Association who are extremely interested in sex differences and have put out sex differences focused grant funding just for that purpose. The Wellcome Trust has just put one out. We also had something called the ARPA-H, which is like DARPA, but it's for health. They put out a funding call. We were narrowly missed out on our funding, which is such a shame, but they were focused on women's health specifically. And we've had for quite a few years now, NIH with the Office of Women's Health Research, we have NIA-related women's health funding calls. So for a long time, there has been a considered and focused effort to try to increase the amount of resources that we can use to try to address these questions. But I think the other piece, and I know we don't want to dwell too much, but I do think it's something that's really important to say, no matter what era that we're in, chronic health issues are of great interest to any population. You go anywhere and people will be in huge support of it. And they want to make sure that we are out there doing what we can to serve the community and make sure that we can make a meaningful and massive change to people's lives, which we can if we can look into these things. As funding focuses or interests change at a global level or at a government level, that is a response to, usually what is the most important chronic illness that we need to tackle. That is also driven a lot by population interest and the community. And if the community want it and they need it, then you need to make that heard, because we are going to be here no matter what. The researchers here are passionate. They're engaged. They want to make a change, and they will do so until they are told they finally have to stop. We're very persistent. And we will also, we work best when we know the community are behind us. And so I think that's sort of where I would want that message to land is there is a lot of people out there who want to optimize women's brain health. They want to understand sex differences. They want to understand how can we best curate and customize treatment and care and diagnostic outcomes by any different demographic strata. My focus is on sex, but these sorts of things are really critical in order to get the best outcome for our population.
Yeah, I love that. And I love that energy and momentum. And I do think, the general population, we have a graying wave that is going to hit us. And there's all sorts of issues that come with that. We don't have enough time to talk about it, but I'm very glad to hear there's energy and momentum and concern. And with that, when you look out the next 10 or 15 years, where do you think we're going to be in this area of focus, and what are you the most hopeful for?
Well, I'm hopeful to be out of a job in 10 years because Alzheimer's disease will have been largely cured. I do honestly think over the next while, we're going to see major changes in Alzheimer's disease dementia in particular. I think that we are on the precipice of huge discovery. And I'm not talking necessarily women's health, that can be a part of it too. But I think at a general level, we're seeing blood tests that are very robust, that can be used to better harness and better screen for clinical trials. We are seeing new drug targets coming out. We're seeing multi-combination therapy. We're starting to look more and more like the cancer field did when it started making major changes. So I think we're in sort of a new era, which is very exciting. And in the next sort of 10 years in particular, the field will not look anything like what it does now. It's almost hard to predict where we're going to be in terms of therapeutics. I think we're going to be in a world where we will be seeing successful combination therapies and manageable dementia. That's what I would like to put my money on. Don't hold me to that, but that's what I'd like to put my money on. The other thing as well, which is something I really don't know where this is going, and it's hard to sort of foresee, but AI is now already, only in the last year or two, already becoming a really big game changer, not just in research, but in pharma. I mean, anywhere, the policy, government, you name it, AI is going to be there. And I don't know what role that's going to play, but I hope, my greatest hope, the most positive outcome we can see there is that AI will help to sift through the thousands and thousands and millions of data points that we have so far and figure out what is the optimized therapies that we can come up with for, at an individual level even, but just at a population level, what are the possible drug targets that we should be aiming for? So I think there's lots of things coming down the pike over the next 10 years. I think that what we recognize as Alzheimer's disease risk now, we won't be seeing that. And I hope that's true for the sake of my young children as well, and for the sake of myself. I hope that we all are able to see different care options, different possibilities for us in the future.
Yeah, I hope that too. This has been fantastic. I appreciate and am very grateful for the time that you spent. How do people get in contact with you if they want to learn more or they want to give you money?
Yes, well, I very much would appreciate that. If anything, to keep the ball rolling, we would so gratefully welcome that. At the moment, probably the easiest way to contact me would be by email. So my email will hopefully be attached to the podcast. And you can also Google me. I think I'm Googleable now, which is insane to think about because I never thought of myself as that important. But I'm also available. I think I'm also not as much on X as I used to be, but I'm definitely on Blue Sky and I'm on LinkedIn. I'm all over the place. The other place that is easy to get in touch with me is via the Alzheimer's Association. So if anybody doesn't know my name by the end of this podcast, that's fine. If you look up the Alzheimer's Association contact, they should be able to find me from there as well.
Well, thank you so much. And, keep pushing forward here. This is amazing.
Thank you so much. It was such a pleasure to speak with you, Deborah.
Thank you for joining Research Renaissance. For more information and to stay updated, subscribe for more episodes and visit our website at tofflertrust.org. Feel free to call us if you have any thoughts, suggestions, or just want to find out more about the Karen Toffler Charitable Trust. Until we meet again, onward and upward.